When I pulled the engine of my 1973 240Z, I mostly followed the instructions of the service manual. Not every step was 100% clear to me, so I still had to look up things online to find the best way to do it. Therefore, I decided to quickly make this video for you as a step-by-step tutorial. Keep in mind, my 240Z might be built a bit different than yours, so not everything might be 100% matching. I definitely would recommend to take a bunch of pictures and videos along the way. This will make the reassembly a lot easier. I also recommend to label all the screws, cables, hoses and bits so you'll know where they belong when reassembling. At first, you need to remove the hood. This goes the best with the help of a friend. Open the hood, hold it on both sides and remove the 4 screws from the hinges. Put the bucket under the radiator to drain the coolant. Unscrew the draining screw. This should be possible by hand, otherwise carefully try with some pliers. Don't forget to remove the filler cap. This will let fresh air in and drains the coolant a lot faster. Once the coolant is drained, you can disconnect the 2 hoses from the engine. My car also had an overflow tank. I also removed that hose. Now the radiator is disconnected. Time to remove the 4 nuts and bolts and carefully pull it out of the car. As you can see, my 240Z also had an aftermarket AC system installed. So next I'm going to disconnect all the hoses and cables from that. Taking the condenser out was pretty easy in my case, since it was not even mounted to the car. The cable didn't have a plug, and since I'm not going to put the AC back, I just cut this wire. Next, I'm going to disconnect the fuel hose that connects the tank to the fuel pump. Disconnecting the 2 heater hoses might get a little bit tricky, since they can get pretty hard to remove. I just cut them open since I'll replace them anyways. Use a heat gun instead to warm the hoses up a little bit. This usually helps to get them removed. But be very careful with the use of pliers, as you might damage the hose or even the steel connection piece underneath. Before actually disconnecting the starter, don't forget to disconnect the battery first. Then you're good to go. Unscrew and unplug all connections. I actually put the first screw back in, as it mounts the starter to the engine. Unplug the oil pressure switch and disconnect the alternator. This last screw is a bit tricky because of this rubber cap. Just be careful to not damage it. Next, disconnect the distributor from the ignition coil and unplug the terminal transmitter. As I have the triple Weber carburetors and not the original ones anymore, these steps may look a bit different than on your car. But first remove the throttle linkage. Then remove the vacuum hose from the intake manifold that goes to the brake master. Everything is now disconnected from the top of the engine. Now it's time to lift the car up, put it on jack stands to disconnect the transmission, propeller shaft and exhaust. Be sure to lift the car on the correct spots. In the front in the center of the axle and in the rear on the differential. Also be sure to place the jack stands under the frame rails. Check the service manual to be sure you got the correct spots to lift and place the car on. Now finally under the car, I'm first going to drain the transmission oil. Don't forget to put a container under it. There's around 1.5 to 1.7 liters of oil in it. After draining the oil, put the draining screw back in. Now remove the clutch operating cylinder with these 2 screws. Unplug the reverse lamp switch. Disconnect the speedometer cable. and disconnect the neutral switch. Now we can disconnect the propeller shaft, also known as drive shaft, from the transmission. Just loosen these 4 nuts and bolts. Make sure your transmission is in neutral and the handbrake is loose. Otherwise you can't turn the shaft by hand to access all the bolts. Once loose, you can just slide the propeller shaft out. Remove the E-clip from the shifter, slide the bolt out, and lift the shifter up. Only thing remaining under the car is the exhaust, and this might get a little bit tricky as they can be really stuck. I actually had to cut mine with an angle grinder and pry it open to remove it, as you can see right here. And the front piece, I had no chance to remove from the exhaust manifold. At first I actually wanted to pull the engine with the exhaust manifold and carbs attached. But since I couldn't remove the exhaust, I needed to remove the carbs and exhaust manifold as well. To remove the carbs, I need to remove the fuel hose that's coming from the fuel pump. After removing the spring, I can now loosen all 6 screws on top of the intake manifold. The lower ones are actually nuts with big washers. With a bit of wiggling, the complete intake manifold will come loose. Now I have good access to remove the remaining nuts from the exhaust manifold and take the manifold out of the engine bay. The speedometer cable is also still attached to the transmission on 2 spots. Take the screw out, remove the speedometer tab, put the screw back in and tighten it. To be on the safe side, I also removed the grille, so it definitely won't get damaged when lifting the engine out. To lift the engine, I also need to mount 2 lifting lugs. One in the rear left, where the exhaust manifold was attached, and the other one in the front right, next to the first spark plug. Now it's time to connect the engine to the engine hoist. I highly recommend also using an engine leveler to hook it up. This makes the engine removal much easier. Connect the hooks to the lifting lugs and carefully put tension on the chains. Then you need to support the transmission with a jack. Once that's done, you can remove the transmission mounting. And in the engine bay, you can also remove the bolts from the engine mountings. Now the engine is completely free and ready to get lifted. Slowly and carefully start to lift up the engine. Once the engine is hanging on the chains and is also well balanced with the leveler, you can lower the jack slowly and remove it. The engine and transmission is now only supported on the chains. Now you can start lifting up the engine right until the transmission would start to touch the transmission tunnel. At this point, the engine needs to be tilted backwards with the engine leveler, just as far so the transmission will not touch the ground. The transmission has now clearance again to the tunnel to be further lifted. Once it comes close to touching again, you need to tilt the engine further. Lifting and tilting goes now back and forth until the bottom end of the engine is higher than the chassis in the front. At this stage you can move the engine hoist very carefully and slowly backwards to move the engine and transmission out of the car. While moving backwards, you also need to readjust the leveler and bring the engine back in balance. This way you don't need to lift it up that high. And that's it. Thanks for watching.